Social protection in its totality, on the one hand, is focusing again on those that are most marginalized and facing the most extreme forms of poverty and food insecurity, but also helping households deal with unexpected shocks. I think what's new is that for developing countries, social protection systems are relatively new. And historically, social protection in most developing countries has really covered that very small portion of the population that's in formal employment. And I think what's really grown over the last 20 years is the extension of social protections to those parts of the population who are outside the formal system, basically, right? Who in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are the large majority of the population. I mean, basically, the poorest of the poor, for the most part, depend on their own resources, right? Most of the poor in most of the world get very little assistance from government, right? Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So they're dependent on their own resources and their own ingenuity to both to deal with risk and to manage their livelihoods, right? And so this is why this is essentially in this area of food security and agricultural production. Is where kind of social protection comes together, in the sense that, on the one hand, social protection, I mean, there's many different forms of social protection, but generally social protection has both a direct impact in terms of immediately relieving, the most acute forms of food insecurity and of poverty, but also in terms of helping build the household capacity to essentially assure its own food security and produce its own food, or at least be able to work and buy the food that it needs, right? FAO for years has this twin track approach to approaching hunger. On the one hand, these direct measures to assure immediate access to food, and the second, more longer-term measures to essentially assure rural livelihoods. And social protection, in a sense, works through both of those tracks, right? Again, because it's this direct impact on the immediate consumption of food, as well as through working through on the agricultural side of households, on their livelihoods, to help them either produce for themselves or to participate more in the market and essentially have more sustainable livelihoods. The From Protection to Production project is a joint effort that we're carrying out with UNICEF, which is receiving funding from DFID and as well as from the EU, which is working with 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Each of these 7 countries, the governments of these countries, is implementing a cash transfer program, which has different modalities in each country, but in most cases it's focusing on the poorest of the poor. So in some of these countries it's the labor-constrained, HIV-affected households, households with orphans and children, etc. It kind of varies from country to country. But in each country it's a government-run program. The objectives of these programs for the most part are on health and education, food consumption, right? But almost all the beneficiaries are agricultural producers, basically, subsistence producers. It's essentially you're giving cash and immediately households will spend that cash, right? And so the impact of the program immediately goes from the beneficiary households to other households in the community that may be selling goods and services, right? And so essentially what we've done is we've developed a model which allows us to look at what's the income multiplier from this program. Okay, so for every dollar, let's say, that's transferred to this community, how much does that generate in terms of additional wealth for the others in the community, basically? Okay, and we find that in fact there are very significant multiplier impacts, in that a dollar transferred often leads to $2 in total benefit in the local economy. There's different kinds of cash transfer programs. In sub-Saharan Africa, they tend to be unconditional. That is, households are given the money and they don't have any, it's not based on any, they don't have to do anything specifically in order to continue receiving that money, right? They have complete flexibility on what they spend it on, though often there's messaging from the program. You know, the money should be spent on children, it should be spent on food, what have you, right? In Latin America, there tends to be conditional cash transfer programs, where actually there's a condition that households need to send their kids to school, they need to go to preventative health checkups, they may have to do other things in order to receive the benefit, right? So there's a big debate as to what's the best approach, right? Clearly, in order to do a conditional cash transfer program, you also need to have the supply of services and to have the administrative capacity in order to enforce those conditions, which in many contexts in sub-Saharan Africa, you don't have. But there's also a big debate as to whether the conditionality is really necessary, and also in the sense that many of the programs in sub-Saharan Africa, they're unconditional, they have messaging, and you have many similar impacts than what you have in Latin America, right? So there's a question as to whether the conditionality is necessary. And then there's also philosophical debates as to whether it's appropriate to put conditions, right? Or whether it's, it goes against people's, rights and entitlements, basically. And so there's a whole debate about issues of rights and entitlements to these programs. FAO's central role in social protection is the nexus of social protection with food security, agriculture, and rural development. Okay? And so FAO has an important role to play in terms of helping governments understand what is the livelihood and the agricultural content and impacts of social protection programs, and why social protection is relevant for livelihoods, right? And why livelihoods are very relevant for social protection programs, but also what is the social protection dimension of more classic agricultural interventions, right? So for example, input subsidy programs. What is the social protection role of input subsidies in terms of, again, reducing risk, helping households manage risk, as well as relieving some of the constraints that households face in terms of their livelihood activities, right? So to me, FAO has a very fundamental potential role in assisting governments and kind of thinking through how those policies go together and how they can be better articulated for a more comprehensive rural development strategy.